In this video, we're going to continue on looking at rational choice procedures. So in the previous video, we looked at what we call the ideal rational choice procedure. This was introduced in the 1940s, 1950s by a group of very impressive academics and researchers. The version of it I'm giving you here is a mature version that's from a book by James March, and I've put a reading on Wattle for those of you that are interested. It's an optional reading. Now, what we're going to do in this video is not talk about the pure idealized rational choice procedure, but talk about how we deviate from it in real life because of the practical considerations that come into play when we're making real decisions. So what we're looking at is what is called limited rationality. You will sometimes hear the word bounded rationality as a technical term for this. But let's just go through these main areas where we are limited in our decision-making capability compared to the pure rational choice model. So the first is attention. We can't attend to everything at once. So the example we used in the previous video was a student choosing 4 courses out of 100. And I stated there that there was approximately 4 million alternatives, 4 million combinations of 4 courses that you could choose from 100. Well, no person can attend to all of those. Possibly a computer could, well, very likely a computer could, but a computer may not necessarily be able to deal with all the other stuff that has to be dealt with, preferences and consequences and so on. So attention is one limiting factor. In the real life, there's too much information. We can't pay attention to everything at once. We can't weigh everything up as much as we would like. The second limitation is memory. So as humans, we have limited ability to store or retrieve information. We have communication limitations. Even if we are using data for decisions and the data is stored on computers, when you get into the real world, those storage systems are not perfect, often because of human characteristics, but it can often be quite hard to find and organize data that you actually know that you have or you should have. The next one is comprehension. So limited ability to actually organize the information, to summarize it, to rank it, to figure out what a reasonable decision rule should be. And the final one here is communication. So in real decision-making situations, the expertise that you need to make the decision, the knowledge, the experience, the information is often held by different groups of people, and they don't necessarily communicate very well with each other. So the example I gave in class on Monday was one that occurs again and again in the literature and case studies about new product development and new service development. And this is where the technical experts on the product or the service come from a very different discipline to the marketing experts and the strategy experts whose job it is to figure out how to sell something. So what happens is you end up with miscommunication. The famous examples are often about physical products, where the marketing team have got a very clear idea of what the market wants and what it needs and what it should look like and what it costs. But you've got design engineers and you've got manufacturing engineers, and they see the whole thing through a different lens. They see a product as something that has to be manufactured, that has to be reliable, that has to be possible to manufacture at a reasonable cost and so on. And the two groups just often don't speak the same language. Now, let's look at the kinds of compromises that we make to the pure rational choice model. So the first one is we constrain the set of alternatives that we look at. Okay, so in the case of our student choosing courses, the student might decide, okay, look, I'm only going to look at sets of courses, sets of 4 courses that constitute a minor. I'm not sure how many minors there are at ANU, but let's say there's 100 or 150. Well, that greatly reduces the number of alternatives that the student needs to consider. And then what she can do is she can look at the minors and maybe choose the one she's interested in, and then she can narrow it down further by weeding out the ones for which she doesn't have prerequisites, for example, or doesn't think she has particularly strong academic abilities. And that way the task becomes a lot easier. The alternatives are just reduced to a much more manageable set. We do this when we select candidates in job selection procedures. We have a triaging process when people send in their applications and resumes, and then so we sort of weed out the ones that have got no chance of being selected, and then there might be a more rigorous triage process to weed it down to a set of people who are going to be interviewed, and then you have the interview process which does the final selection. The second thing that we do is we limit the set of consequences that we consider. So instead of every possible consequence, for example, of a set of courses chosen by a student, she might just consider the ones that are most important to her. They might be about what she thinks the impact will be on her GPA and what she thinks potential employers in the areas in which she would like to work after graduation would think of the set of courses. And then, having limited the set of consequences to be considered, that greatly reduces the cognitive task that's involved in making the choice. Then we look at preferences. So we can have lots of preferences in decisions, and in real world business decisions, it's very often not just the preferences of the decision maker that's involved. It's the preferences of various other stakeholders. It might be other parts of the organization. It might be employees. Could be, shareholders or the people on the board of the company. Could be government regulators. So the task becomes very complex if you start to try and think of everyone who might have a relevant preference. And so what you do is you go through some process, a bit like the one of choosing the consequences or the alternatives, of triaging and narrowing down the set of preferences that you're actually going to use in your decision rule. And then we come to the decision rule itself. So the key idea here is in the pure rational choice model, the objective is to get the absolute best possible alternative. But what we often do is we use what is called a satisficing approach. And that is that we decide, well, it's going to be too hard or take too much time and resources to figure out for sure what the absolute optimum alternative is. So what we'll do is we'll set a threshold for what is good enough, and we'll start searching through the alternatives and examining the alternatives until we find one that's good enough. So that's a very common tactic that we use in decision making. And the key issue there is where you set that threshold. And the idea is that you shouldn't be too lazy about it. Okay, you should set a threshold that actually will guarantee you as good a decision as is possible, given the time and resources that you have. But there's been a lot of study of this and how people, under some circumstances, will set what are actually pretty low thresholds that are lower than they need to be. And then the final thing is, unlike in the rational choice procedure, we probably have incomplete knowledge of all of this stuff. And so we are, to some extent, making estimates and guesses. We have a go at estimating probabilities of things and so on. So that is actually all you really need to know about the rational choice procedure. There's a vast literature on this, and we could have a whole course about it, but one problem is it gets very mathematical very quickly, and it also tends to move away pretty quickly from practical application. The key thing I want you to take away from this is that we should think consciously when we're making decisions about how the decision procedure we use, how far it deviates on these points from the ideal. And the objective there is to make sure that we don't get lazy about it and use decision procedures that are very poor when we could afford to use better ones. Thank you.